Hello everybody, it is Mike Levin on Sunday, November 21st, 2021. And when last we left off, I think I talked about an hour and 10 minutes or so before I got to Microsoft Playwright. So, yet another keyword in the whole mix of things, you can do with technology. There's just such a big bag of keywords there for you to reach into and grab and specialize in some technology or other. And there are also categories in there. The software category that Microsoft Playwright belongs to is browser automation. And there is a king of the hill in browser automation. It's a member, I believe, of the free and open source software community. I have installed it from time to time over the years. It falls into a similar category as JavaScript to me. Things I've taken up and then put aside because the value proposition was not correct. What I could get out of it, the added benefit in my life, was not worth the cost. And in the field of SEO, to put browser automation aside for any number of years is a pretty big deal, because there's certain things you can only do if you do it with a bona fide and genuine web browser that is capable of making the websites it's visiting think it's a human being. So a lot of the bots out there these days actually have the Chrome browser built into them because Google created inter-process communication application, API hooks. Back in my day with the Amiga computer, we called it IPC, inter-process communication. These days, it just tends to be referred to as the program having an API. So browsers have an API. I believe they have for a long time, even under the Mozilla project, which is Firefox. And so for a long time, Selenium controlled Firefox directly. And for whatever reason, when Chrome had its API, made public, Selenium did not step in to control it directly. They continued controlling some, pale imitation of a web browser called the Chrome driver.exe, and you always had to Google up what you were hoping was the latest official Chrome driver.exe. And if you weren't using that under Selenium, you were using some other crazy kooky thing. There was something called Phantom.js, which I believe was an extraction from Firefox, since Firefox, Mozilla, free and open source. Things can be taken out of that. So I think an equivalent to Chrome driver.exe was made for the Firefox world so that you didn't have to automate all of Firefox. But then you could also automate all of Firefox. It was very regular for Selenium to control Firefox. And this software was used in testing, testing websites a lot. And then there's the challenge of emulating different pieces of hardware, like mobile devices, which Chrome does really well, but was not really given as a gift to the Selenium world as part of Chrome automation, because they didn't really use Chrome for automation. It was Chrome driver.exe. There's a distinction to be made. So, the API to Chrome was exposed publicly to the world. Lots of people use it when they right-click on objects in Chrome and bring up the inspector, and it's inspect element. There's this whole Chrome inspector interface, and it was not easy to do browser automation with the API exposed. So Google, who made Chrome, made the public client library Puppeteer that you could install locally as JS. Now it was installed through NPM, which means it was not really controlling Chrome directly, but Node.js controls, Puppeteer, which is an NPM, the Node Package Manager, now also owned by Microsoft. Many sub-stories here. Microsoft did not just buy GitHub, Microsoft bought NPM, the package manager for Node. So they're really moving around and doing all these strategic acquires so that the whole development stack, the whole web dev stack, even if you fancy yourself a full web stack developer, which generally means Chrome on the client side, the browser, the end user like you and me, are sitting at a computer or holding a mobile phone, and on that computer or mobile phone is the Chrome browser. And then you write apps that reside in the Chrome browser because it's been setting the standard on ECMA, JavaScript modern implementation, with all these new things like, it used to be just callbacks, and then callbacks became promises, and then promises became async await. And so the API of JavaScript is advancing quickly because of the, advances in the language from the European consortium driving it forward. Google, controlling Chrome and the public version of it, Chromium, the free and open source version of it, advances their JavaScript engine forward quickly to stay in sync. They're probably the driving force behind these proposed advancements, because there's an organization there reviewing proposals, accepting them, working on the implementation. Well, maybe not even working on the implementation. It's up for the browsers too. So, long story short, for many years now, Chrome has been the king of the hill in the browser world. So much so that Microsoft themselves, who had their whole alternative code base called Explorer, Microsoft Internet Explorer, that goes all the way back to the thing they made to compete with Netscape Navigator. In the 90s, its lineage, I think, goes back to the late 90s. But it's being totally phased out. When you upgrade to Windows 7, Windows 11, shows where my mind is at. If they did a numbering system logically from back in the day, they'd probably be up to about Windows 7. But they did, naming fudging so that they could get themselves up to 10 to be in sync with Mac OS X, right? So it's just a marketing thing to jump ahead to 10 for the new millennium and stuff. Switching between naming conventions after years and naming conventions after versions. It's all just marketing, right? It doesn't matter. It's just a code name that was turned into a real product name. So Windows 11 it is, right? And when you go to Windows 11, there's no longer any Internet Explorer. It's officially Edge, which means it's officially Microsoft's lifting or forking of the Google Chromium code base, which is the free and open source part of Chrome, because not all Chrome is free and open source. There's the proprietary bits. So whereas unlike Microsoft, who says VS Code, oh yeah, it's free and open source, and then doesn't even push or promote a true free and open source version of VS Code, where's the Chromium-like version of VS Code? There is none, because no one would use VS Code without all the proprietary bits that Microsoft sprinkles in that completely taints and ruins their assertion that VS Code is free and open source. It's not. It's not. It might be open source, but it's utterly, encumbered, and you could not embed VS Code necessarily in its full glory into your projects. You could probably find the parts of it that don't have the proprietary bits, the Chromium equivalent, and embed portions of that into your app, like the way GitHub is doing with GitHub Spaces. So Microsoft is really using that advantage to great effect to push the state of GitHub forward by having, not only the cloud backend to run your code through Azure, ripoff of Amazon, but the front end to be able to look like it's running your code in the web browser via VS Code components brought up through the web browser, through the GitHub site, labeled GitHub Spaces. You ought to check it out. It's a really disruptive technology, and right to the heart of the point I'm making with this video, which is about Microsoft's amazing ability to continue to butt into your development toolbox and make tools of theirs necessary components of your set of tools, your toolbox. Sometimes people say tool chain, but that implies the dependency chain of like a software build. GCC, the public, the free and open source C compiler, C++ compiler that LLVM is built into, that's so popular and important these days because ultimately really almost everything compiles in the GCC, the free and open source GNU C compiler, right? One of the punchlines to a lot of stories is that no matter what technology you choose, its tool for making, tools, the tools for making tools are written in some version of C and compiled with GCC in the first place. So why isn't everyone just learning, some version of C and compiling it under GCC? Well, the answer is a lot of people are. A lot of people who write operating systems and drivers really do work that way because the advantage is that large. But for the casual developer, C and most versions of it, most C derivatives, including Java for that matter, really just aren't worth it. Just aren't worth it. The benefit you get out of having a closely native C language is not worth having to know most derivatives of C. Now, I would make one exception to the rule. Everyone should spend some time with ANSI standard C. ISO standard, ANSI standard, C, like I think it might be 1999 version. There's a few different names of it out there, but if you just Google up standard C, not C++, not Objective-C, what are some of the other, C#, there's so many, even in its own way, the massively popular Rust is one of these, a C derivative. Maybe not really down there. When you look closely, a lot of these languages have other lineages underneath. Like you'll find the Lisp lineage behind a lot of these things, like Clojure, another thing that I believe looks like C, but has the Java. It sits on the Java runtime engine, so it's compiled in C. But some of these things you'll find alternatives to the C compile world out there. They exist, they're few and far between, but you find them compiled in some other very low-level language like Lisp or Scheme or Common Lisp. And someone, was asking me in notes of or comments of my last video about Guile, and I didn't know Guile, and I went and Googled Guile, and Guile sounds very interesting. There's some things that are very tied to the Lisp lineage, which is like an alternative bizarro lineage to C, in the GNU tool set. And the GNU tool set are things that are created mostly back in the day by Richard Matthew Stallman, RMS, the person who looked at Unix and said, oh, this would all be great if it were just free and open source, although he didn't use those words. He would really hate the free and open source movement of today. He is still around. He's one of these granddaddies of the modern world. Grandparents of the modern world. I'm trying to get my gendering correct. It's not the father of Unix, but it's the parent of Unix. But he's the parent of GNU Unix, which stands for GNU is not Unix, in those self-referential acronyms, inside jokes that are sprinkled all throughout the Linux and Unix world. But what I'm saying here is that there's some interesting stuff there. You can spend a lifetime just looking through the stuff that's part of that initiative, and one of those things is Guile. And Guile appears to be bash script on steroids, bash script rethought, a la the sort of Bell 9 people who came up with an alternative to Unix. If Unix was rethought in modern ways, getting rid of a lot of its problematic underpinnings, you would get Bell 9, which comes from the same Bell Lab people. The Bell in Bell 9 is for Bell Labs. So people who like bizarro alternative operating systems that got a lot right from scratch and rethought stuff, like the BOS back in the day. A lot of the Amiga people went to the BOS because it rethought a lot of that Amiga stuff with modern sensibilities. But if you want just the purely Unix stuff rethought with modern sensibilities, Bell 9 might be for you. But again, 80-20 rule. Most people are going to be using derivatives of Linux, and mostly derivatives of either Red Hat or Debian Linux, right? The two great-grandparent lineages of Linux that are popular today in most standard easy versions. Standard easy versions of Linux means it's got systemd in it. It means you can orchestrate an entire Linux startup process according to some standard set of conventions that rip off Apple and what they did in the Darwin fork of Linux. Okay, or of Unix, let me correct that, Unix. They forked, I believe, BSD or some version of free and open source Unix. Apple forked Unix for Darwin. So if you want an alternative to free BSD, you could look at Darwin Unix. It's them contributing back in exactly the way Google's contributing back with the Chromium version of Chrome. So if you say you want the Chrome browser, but you want it just in free and open source, you can install Chromium and you can have it as a desktop application to use just without some of the proprietary bits Google sprinkles in. Maybe account syncing or something, bookmark syncing, I'm not sure. And if you wanted to do the same, if you looked at the Macintosh and say, oh, that's really running on Unix underneath, and I want to get that Unix and have it installed locally, but without all the Macintosh proprietary bits, you could install Darwin and have it. Apple is doing good by this free and open source social contract. Now, there's details of this social contract inside the licenses that are chosen for whatever versions are derived from. Some force you to volunteer back your code, and it might have been the case with Darwin. It might not be true altruism that causes Apple to give Darwin back to the Linux community. But it might be the licensing. But the fact they're doing right by it, unlike Linksys back in the day with the WRT router, where they were forced by litigation to do it. Google gives back with Chromium, but VS Code is allegedly free and open source. Where's VS Code without all the proprietary bits? Where's the Chromium? Where's the Darwin of VS Code? It's not. Well, I gotta Google this. When I get home, maybe I'll Google this. But the fact it's not a common thing, the fact it's not promoted, the fact it's not well known among the tech community, tells you a lot about Microsoft's intent for VS Code. Microsoft plans to control your muscle memory for development, for software dev. When you say WebDev, it has a grab bag of things it means. It has a grouping of implications it means. Only just 2 or 3 years ago, that group of implications for WebDev did not include Microsoft. People were jumping on the full WebDev stack, were using things like, I don't know, there really was no great choice. Let's say Sublime. Let's say Atom, ATOM, the text editor from GitHub. So the GitHub ATOM, the GitHub Atom combo, that 1-2 punch, and the promise of it owning the full WebDev stack was very, very large. and Microsoft bought GitHub and killed Adam. I mean, they didn't fully kill Adam, but they said that 1-2 punch strategy owned the community where everyone synchronizes Git, where everyone chooses as their Git repo location, because distributed software version controlling, oh my God, there's so many sub-nested stories here. CVS and SVN, the prior ways of doing software version control were inadequate. Along comes distributed version control, where every copy of the software repository had the entire history of the project, and any of them could arbitrarily, given the right hosting conditions, be turned into the main repo, the one where everyone pulls from, pushes to, checks out from, checks into, etc., etc. Pulling and pushing is the real API for Git, but everyone talks about checking out and checking in because API mappings have been made between Git and the prior generation of tools that thought in those terms, SVN and CVS. So GitHub ain't easy, but it was written by Linus Torvalds for the Linux kernel, so it won. Git won because Linux, momentum, early mover advantage, not first mover advantage, because Linus just copied the proprietary thing they were using beforehand, before that changed its licensing and forced Linus to look for alternative, revision control, distributed revision control. So he did, his own C-based, distributed revision control, and Linus, being the Git he is, named it Git, because he's the Git who copied, I can't even remember its name, Bitstream, something like that. I don't know, there's dramatic stories there. Maybe I'll tell them. I'll learn the details someday and tell them. But there were contenders. One of the big contenders was called Mercurial and Python. Its short name was HG, and it was API compatible with Git. So it could have been HG. It wasn't HG because Git. When you used Mercurial, you could embed it into your Python packages. And I, in fact, started out on Mercurial because I had this purist notion under Python. Then I lost that. If I were to maintain that purity, then I would be on like Ruby, insisting everything be done object-oriented. Python's not for purists. Python's for pragmatists, pragmatic people. So, the pragmatic person says being on Git and jumping on that particular bandwagon outweighs some theoretical ability to embed HG, Mercurial, into your Python projects. And in a pinch, you could embed Git into your projects. You just use the communication between the command line. And that's what you should be doing anyway as your first API love. Okay? Love of APIs. Not everything is love-worthy. What the fuck are you doing? Your lane disappeared. So someone was in a lane that was disappearing and hunked me over that, right? And then what an idiot coming up next to me, expecting me to speed up for them, to slow down for them. If you're in a lane that's disappearing, you're the one who has to yield to the person who's in the lane that's not disappearing. You don't hunk at the person who's going at a consistent speed, dumbass. Anyway, that's my road rage for this YouTube video. So Git wins the day. So Python wins the day because, oh my God, I have these discussions with coworkers who have these incorrect assumptions that I have to set straight. That Python is somehow less, popular for web work. Django back to 2005. Oh, those Django-based, Python websites are really the small ones. Instagram, Dropbox. Come on, people. It's because Python is no drama. Python is the invisible technology that, just works, and thus people don't have to talk about a lot. That's always in the background, churning away, doing, billions of transactions per second distributed over, an infrastructure that allows that to occur, with maybe C Python swapped out for PyPy or some other thing to optimize the hot spots, okay, this is real tangential. Where was I going with all this? Microsoft steals, because in free and open source you can. It's official to steal. It's flattery. So Microsoft has purged Internet Explorer out of Windows, and when you go to Windows 11, the Edge browser is based on Google's Chromium free and open source code. And so now Microsoft has the need to do testing, browser testing. They're not using Selenium because everyone's distancing themselves from Selenium now. Step one in using Selenium is to invite the world of unwanted tech liability down on your head. A fat install that requires the Java runtime and a bunch of other back-end database stuff that just, I want to automate a browser. I just need the browser. Well, with the one small price of Node.js installed locally, you can now do that without Selenium, and that's a pretty big deal. You can do it with reliability, with official browser vendor support, and greater speed, because less technical parts, less moving parts means less to start up, which means you can instantiate more instances of it at the same time, which means better scalability in your testing, better scalability than Selenium by a long shot. What else? The list goes on. So Microsoft inevitably had to jump on the Puppeteer bandwagon. Microsoft had to start using the Puppeteer library that was published by Google in order to control Chrome and Chromium through their browser APIs. However, it was partially implemented. It was not completely implemented. There were lots of missing holes in Puppeteer, like controlling more browsers than just Chrome and Chromium, for starters, but other things like storing out session and, isolating you a little bit from the underlying JavaScript so that you didn't have to be a JavaScript guru to merely automate a browser. Okay, and also it forced you into asynchronous mode, which I gotta tell you, it's the kiss of death for a certain brand of Python developer who's been using automation type Python tools up till now and is used to just writing in traditional script file type fashion. A lot of network automation stuff is done by Python. Again, it's the untouted, untalked about workhorse of this world. Google Metasploit to see some of these tools that are out there. I believe that, things, I'm not sure about, there's something called Sharkwire. If you want to listen to network traffic, there's things that do that interact with some Unix tools. But I believe the APIs to those types of things are generally Python. So whenever you're doing, high-end network type stuff that, does diagnostics, that does intrusion detection, that, does load balance, all this stuff, that controls your cloud component. It's almost always Python. It's controlling your virtual machine stack. It's almost always Python, right? Sometimes they're doing Node, but, the same nervousness about Node exists to any other newish technology. Python has been around forever and has been a free and open source embeddable, language forever. So what there? So there's a high level of confidence in embedding Python into your other products, or to, create packages for Python, for your product to be a Python package, right? There's there's a long history of that. This is going back now something like 30 years. Node is somewhat new to the scene, and if you accept Node, you have to accept a lot of these other things. Well, this is true with any language or technology or execution engine. There's so many names for this stuff. What is the runtime? They all use the same tricks now to optimize. They either compile now to true machine code. That's happening more and more often. I noticed the JavaScript world compiling to true machine code with knowledge of the machine you're compiling for. Or more often, these tools compile to pseudocode or P code, or something one level above for your particular machine. It's still bytecode. It's still machine instructions, but it's for a virtual machine. Okay, so sometimes it's a virtual machine. They talk about this runtime engine. Certainly Java likes to call it a virtual machine. The JRE, Java Runtime Engine, is commonly called as a VM and thought of as something special about how Java works, but it's just not true. Almost everything works that way with some sort of virtual machine. And if it's not a virtual machine, it seems nowadays to be going all the way to machine code for your architecture, whatever it is, x86, ARM64, whatever. And so all these technologies basically work this way and compile down to that. And when you hear people talk about a Turing complete language, and no language is really anything done in language A could be done with sufficient work in language B, so long as it's Turing complete. And so what language you choose doesn't matter. Myth, false. While any language that's Turing complete could technically allow you to do what could be done in any other language, the difference is whether you will commit suicide in the process of trying to do it or fall in love with the whole language process runtime environment. Oh, this brings the video full circle because I got to wrap up soon. I'm almost home. The concept of loveworthiness. Loveworthiness is important. Nuance is important. In the nuance of the code required for that runtime environment, you either will or will not find loveworthiness. And when you don't find loveworthiness, sometimes you got to give it a go for a little bit, and you will find it. JavaScript world knows this very well because there is a very popular book that I had read called JavaScript: The Loveworthy Parts, or the loveworthy bits. I think it's something, yeah. And so this was back before promises, before async await, and I think it was in the days of callbacks. Non-blocking I/O possible, but the nested ziggurat of JavaScript code you would need to construct was mind-numbingly complex. However, it could let you do some things that were massively popular, powerful, and popular. It's what drove a lot of today's JavaScript popularity, as they cleaned up the API surrounding it, and with two major API overhauls, they were able to get modern async await, which is, less objectionable than most things they could have done. If you want to make concurrency understandable, make it look like non-concurrent code, and that's what async await does. And there's just this deferring and then do it now, shoot me now or shoot me later, right? If you want to understand async await, watch the old classic Warner Brothers Daffy Duck cartoon, Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny, with shoot me now or shoot me later. At the end of that, you will understand async await, I promise you. So JavaScript moved forward, and now the whole thing is overall a little bit more loveworthy because of ECMA organization pushing things forward and making it loveworthy. However, the syntax surrounding it is not loveworthy to me. Once you fall in love with Python first, if you allow yourself to get brain damaged by Python being your first programming language, in the way, I got to get the guy's name. He's a famous developer who said you get brain damaged if BASIC is your first programming language. And I tend to agree with him. It might have been the same developer who spoke out against regular expressions, regular expression matching, the regex engine, and I completely disagree with him there. However, if your brain has to be damaged, if the synaptic patterns have to be too overwhelmingly strong to see past it, especially if you're a static thinker. If you're one of these people who in the early days of Raspberry Pi played, Don't Pile on the Rabbit on me because they couldn't see the utility of the Raspberry Pi because they were static thinkers stuck in their one of two worlds, YouTube gamers who are like, yeah, but does it run Halo or whatever it was during the day, and static C compiler people who are also Java people, they have difficulty, they have anger management issues when it comes to technology other than their favorite static compiled ones. And Python triggers them every time. Oh my God, if you want to see someone flip out over, technology not being allowed in their shop, but if it was, things could be 10 times better, try to get Python into a Java shop showing them how much better the world could be under Python. They will not like it. Now, you might say Python is the same with, Python people are the same with Java. Not true. Python love to wrap APIs, other people's APIs, in Python. It's one of their favorite pastimes in Elastic Computing Cloud and Hadoop and all this other stuff. I think even Sparks, I'm not sure. But all this Java technology, Selenium, is, wrapped regularly and made very popular in the Python world as part of mainstream projects. Python people have no problem passing through to Java unless their per machine cost needs to be gotten down, unless the technology stack underneath the Python API calls needs to be squeezed smaller. In that case, you're best off with native Python or compiled C components to do the fancy work. And if you get religion in the Python world, it's the Pythonicness of it, because when you wrap someone else's API in Python, their stuff is going to percolate up and be part of the API in Python. And that's what happens with Puppeteer. And that was really scary because, Puppeteer is not official. It's the port of Puppeteer to Python, which is often so easy to do. It's a toy project for developers who are trying to cut their teeth and make a little notoriety. Something new comes out that's not Python. Someone in the Python community rushes to create the first wrapper for it, releases it into GitHub, and it becomes massively popular because, they're scratching an itch that lots of other people are going to have. Certainly with Puppeteer, that was the case. So Puppeteer goes abandoned. The reason it goes abandoned is because Microsoft has hired the developers of Puppeteer. And Puppeteer starts to go stale. The action and excitement appears over at Microsoft under a new project back in 2020. It might have been January of 2020. It might have been out for a long time now, and it's only taking me now this much to catch up, because when I do Puppeteer versus, right, I like to see what fills in, to see what, is coming out there. Also, I installed a headless plugin browser to record my Puppeteer motions, and you can record for Puppeteer or for Playwright. So if Playwright was such similar commands as Puppeteer, as I toggled back and forth, I had to go look at what this, how can it be that similar and popular enough to be in a plugin? And I discovered Microsoft did exactly what they did with the Edge browser, which is to take Google's contribution to the free and open source world with Chrome, with the Chromium bits. They lifted that up and they made Microsoft Edge. Now, in order to automate it and test it and to steal the thunder of Google and Puppeteer, they stole the Puppeteer developers, they forked the Puppeteer code, and they created Playwright. So now Playwright can control Edge, Playwright can control Chrome and Chromium, Playwright can control Firefox and all the Mozilla derivatives, and Firefox can control Opera, and Firefox can control Safari, not Firefox, I'm saying Playwright can control Safari. I'm saying Firefox now because it was one. Okay, but you get it. Microsoft Playwright can control a lot more browsers. And when you do testing and you're sometimes simulating a user with login, and I close that last browser and then you open a new browser, one of the difficulties is opening it with the same initial state, the cookie information, the session, because the end thing you're connecting to doesn't need to know your browser was closed. If it opens again with the exact same state, like serialization of an old state, you don't have to log in again so long as your session didn't expire or whatever. And that seems like it should be a core fundamental feature of these tools. It was not on Puppeteer. I hand-coded that on Puppeteer on the JavaScript side, not even Puppeteer. I needed those types of things, and I got so nervous on Puppeteer with it being unofficial and Puppeteer starting to look abandoned that I'm like, oh no, this is bad. So I started my latest work on Puppeteer, got so nervous, decided to do my research about Playwright, and discovered how fully Microsoft is ripping off Google here too in their no-holds-barred battle to dominate the WebDev development stack, which only 2 or 3 years ago Microsoft didn't even need to be in it. But now you can't get into WebDev without everyone pushing you into VS Code. GitHub, naturally, Microsoft bought that. If you're on the JavaScript stack, you're using NPM, Microsoft bought that. So Microsoft is, if you like Linux is the way to go, they're like, oh, run the Linux subsystem on Windows, and it's a great way to do it. And if you're on Windows 11, you have graphics, Linux graphics. I'm gonna wrap up here. You get the idea. Microsoft has, and for the foreseeable future will do everything within their power to own the tools, and thus you, via your muscle memory, in the web dev development stack. Microsoft owns you because your muscle memory, your know-how, is being tied to a proprietary, non-free and open source product called VS Code. And that's for starters. If you're using Azure services and using their custom APIs, that makes it worse. If you're, that's the 1-2 punch there. There's other things. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up there. I'm going to put my food order in. Thanks for joining me. Don't forget to think about your Microsoft dependency, and don't forget to subscribe.